Hello, thank you for joining another episode of Burn the Wagon. I just want to send some prayers out for all the people that are suffering from domestic violence, anyone that's suffering from mental health issues, anyone that's gone missing or has been murdered. And I also want to put prayers out for yourselves for being here today. And above all else, I want to put prayers down for Mother Earth. So thank you for joining Burn the Wagon. We're here to burn the wagon that is capitalism, burn the wagon that is patriarchy, burn the wagon that is colonialism. So today I'm going to have a really special guest, Morningstar, with me, who I'm going to invite right now. About all kind of stuff, all the work that she's been doing. So yeah, thank you for joining us. What's up? What's up, Uli? So yeah, just invite. And if you want to go ahead and join me whenever you want. Yep. Some sage for you. Hopefully you can join me whenever you stuff going over there. Hey, hello.
Shimmy Sunwee, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I apologize, it wasn't letting me accept on my iPad, so I'm here on my phone now. There we go.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate it. So thank you for joining me today. So I just want to get started. Just give yourself an introduction. Like just what you kind of just sent me yesterday, like where you were born. You said you were born in the Oakland AIM house, correct? So I kind of just let you go from there.
Correct. Shimmy Sunwee, my name's Morningstar Gali. I am Ajumawi Band of Pitt River. Pitt River Tribe is located in northeastern California, up by Mount Shasta. It encompasses the 4 county areas of Shasta, Modoc, Lassen, and Siskiyou. We have 3.5 million acres that were reclaimed during the Pitt River land claims after Alcatraz Island. I was born at the Aim for Freedom Survival School, which is also known as the Oakland AIM House. Back in the 1960s and 70s, my father was incarcerated at San Quentin State Penitentiary for his involvement with Third World Liberation Front. And the student strikes to get ethnic studies into the schools of San Francisco State and San Mateo College. And so from his time incarcerated, he had been organizing behind the prison walls at San Quentin. He was released in 1978, and he had moved into the Oakland Aim for Freedom Survival School with my mom. I was born during a 4-day ceremony that was held there. A 4-day birth ceremony where they had a sacred fire lit, where they would get up every morning for a sunrise gathering. So that's how I was named, and still continue to help to organize and support the annual sunrise gatherings that we hold on Alcatraz Island every October for Indigenous Peoples Day, every November for Indigenous Peoples Thanksgiving. So yeah, just wanted to share that information.
Wow, that's amazing. So organizing is just in your blood. You've been organizing since you came out of the womb. That's amazing. And you said you grew up in Oakland until you were 12, right? Let's talk about that experience a little bit, because I hadn't realized that there were so many natives based in the Bay Area. And yeah, let's just talk about that growing up in Oakland a little bit.
Sure. So Oakland, so I'll just back up a little bit and share that my Pitt River grandma, my Ajumawi grandma, and my Ilocano grandfather, my Filipino grandfather, my grandfather came over from the Philippines in the late 1920s, and he made his way up to Pitt River and worked in the flower fields. And so even though neither of my grandparents were, they didn't speak very much English, but they were able to, I say they spoke the language of love, and they were able to get married, had 6 boys. Still in the late 1920s, it was very much seen as an interracial relationship. There was a lot of racial discrimination against them. And so they moved to the Sacramento Valley area. They moved to Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu tribal lands, which is where I'm at today. And so it's been really kind of an interesting full circle for myself and for the healing within our family, because my grandfather worked as a farm worker. There's many California Native and Filipino peoples throughout, not only throughout the state, but throughout the West Coast that were known as Indo-Pinos. And so Bay Area, yeah, so in the Bay Area, they a really large population of urban Native peoples. And so due to the termination and relocation eras, how they were promised bus tickets and jobs and housing, and then they came to the Bay and realized that none of that was true, how they, so part of the way in which I was raised was that our teachers and our educators were the student occupiers that were on Alcatraz. And so on Alcatraz, there was a schoolhouse called the Little Red Schoolhouse that was created by the students there. And so when the occupation ended after those 19 months, they decided to create the school, recreate the school in Oakland. And so that became known as Hintel Kuka within the Pomo language. And so Hintel Kuka still exists today up in the Oakland Hills. The parents and community fought really hard to get the school out of the flatlands, out of East Oakland where we were growing up, and to ensure that if the school was in the Oakland Hills, that we would have a better, just a better environment in terms of our school environment. We were given breakfast every day. That was part of the Black Panther program of the 1960s. So all of these little Indian kids, in Oakland very much benefited from the Black Panther Party's 10-point program and having a free breakfast program for us. And so we would go to Hintel as a both before and after school program for our parents that, had to work for full days. And so we would go to Hintel in the morning, be able to eat breakfast, go to our regular elementary school day, come back from our school, and then we were able to be at Hintel until 5:30 p.m. until our parents could pick us up. And so we had a very safe, nurturing school environment where we learned pine needle basket making, we learned how to gather acorns, we learned how to gather seaweed, and took a lot of trips out to the ocean and would gather clams and mussels. Our teachers taught us a lot about the Alcatraz occupation. They taught us a lot about what it meant for us, in terms of the sovereignty and self-determination of us living, relocated from our homeland, from our communities, but we very much grew up with an understanding of, of a connection to our ceremonies, a connection to our cultural ways, of a connection to all of our practices. And I really do credit them for that, because that was a part of the larger movement of Indian self-determination. That was a part of the larger movement of the Alcatraz occupation, where so much was taken from us during boarding school, through foster care systems, to remove the Indian from us as Indian children. That was all reinstilled in terms of the pride and, just our own self-worth and self-esteem as Native kids. So I grew up there, throughout the age of 11. I lived for a short time down in Redwind. Redwind is down by San Luis Obispo, in the Los Padres National Forest. And so that was a community that was built at that time for Chumash peoples and for surrounding tribal peoples. And so they had actually built hogans there. And, so we had our little loft hogans there, and were raised. We didn't have electricity in our homes, but we didn't have, there wasn't indoor plumbing in terms of having toilets, but we had like outhouses, bathhouses. So I also had that experience growing up of what it meant, what it meant to live without electricity and without those basic necessities. But that was really a great experience as well, because we were raised in a community where we had a schoolhouse, taught by our parents, aunties, uncles, all the AIM babies, essentially, that, had been born and living in Oakland. A lot of us spent a couple of years living in Redwind in our own kind of little community.
Wow, that's amazing. And we have somebody commented that survivor foster care system. Thank you. So yeah, you're that sounds amazing. Wow, that's a lot to unpack because that's a lot. That's a lot. You know, that's amazing to think about. They're still teaching these ways in, like you said, the urban native. Because I grew up on the reservation, and I didn't know any of these things. I wasn't taught any of these things.
Sure,
So to think, you know, that that is happening in in the cities, why don't we have it on our own reservation?
sure.
Um,
And that
and
was design, right? That was by design to, create that distance from, those practices to, and so I think that, they were very visionary at the time, that our aunties and uncles were very visionary in terms of like understanding that, a lot of these practices weren't being on. And so to have that in the city and to have it available for us so that we were able to connect, to our extended tribal communities. And so that's what we did. We spent a lot of our trips going camping. We camped a lot in Point Reyes and we went to Kuliloklo. And so at the time of when I was 10 years old, we started dancing in the roundhouse there at Kuliloklo with Lanny Panola. And we had a dance group called the Hintel Dancers. And so with that, we were able to, relearn. And I remember at the time, I was probably one of the only kids that wasn't Pomo or Coast Miwok. And so I was asking questions and just, asking if that was okay and if that was appropriate. And I remember that Lanny was like, these dances are very similar to your dances, with your tribe. And because we didn't have at the time, they were still very underground at the time, we didn't have dance groups, especially youth dance groups that were practicing at the time. I was really welcomed in, me and my sister and our entire family was welcomed into those Coast Miwok roundhouse practices. And those are still teachings with me today and carry with my children, because recognizing how special that was for us, and even the effort of being youth cultural ambassadors at the time and taking those dances to the different schools and the different events. We would dance during the American Indian Film Institute, the annual American Indian Film Festival. We were able to travel to Hawaii, and
wow,
that we spent 10 years, or I'm sorry, we spent 2 weeks. I was 10 or 11 years old, and we spent 2 weeks on the Big Island participating in a cultural exchange. So it was a whole plane. If I was young, it felt like a whole plane full of California and Nevada Indian people. And we were able to spend 2 weeks on the island, going to the schools, sharing our dances, sharing all of our songs. It was the first time that I really remember learning about sacred sites in the way that it was very explicit in them saying, these are sacred places that you are welcome to go to. We were able to watch lava flow into the water at Kilauea. That was a really incredible experience. And so I remember coming away from that, just understanding how deep our connection is. We call it the Rainbow Bridge, that our people have always traveled and our people have always shared in our cultural traditions and learning. And so learning that at a very young age, and then being able to carry on those lessons and those practices today with our Kanaka relatives, and how we still share in our struggle to protect our sacred lands. In 2019, went to Mauna Kea and was able to bring both my oldest and youngest daughters out there, and to just support our relatives in that way.
and you talk about sacred lands and protecting things. I kind of want to move into you being tribal water organizer, and you protecting the salmon, helping protect the salmon. And I just want to get that issue out there to the people and let them get informed on that stuff.
Absolutely. Again, that goes back to, so I lived in the Bay Area up until the time that my dad passed away. I was right before I turned 16 years old. And so at that time, I was having a lot of difficulty in school. I think in, the public school system. At 13, I had been expelled from school. At 15, I had been expelled again, was moving around to different schools and really just struggling. My father, after his incarceration, he was one of the first people to be hired on by California Department of Corrections. In rehabilitation, CDCR, he was hired as the first full-time spiritual advisor by the state. And so he would go in and, we would spend our weekends gathering medicine and gathering willows, and we would go, and have all of the materials needed so that our relatives inside the prisons would be able to sweat. And he was working really hard, but he was working really hard to the point that it really affected his health, that from his time of being incarcerated to, turning around and being able to walk back into the prisons and help in that way. And so when I was 15, he passed away, and I moved up to Pitt River at that time. And I moved with my aunt and uncle. And so a lot of our practices would be filleting salmon, learning how to, hang the salmon up in the smokehouse, learning how to dry it out, just all of the processing that goes with it. And so I also understood that we don't have salmon any longer within our Pitt River, that it's been over 90 years now that we haven't had salmon within our rivers. And that was part of the promises that PG&E failed to put on in instilling fish ladders within our rivers, that they promised if they were going to create the 6 to 7 dams that they've created of Pitt 1, 2, et cetera, that there would be those fish ladders. But we all know that, in terms of killing a people, that you start with killing their food source. And so for California Native peoples, that's our food source. For people that may not understand, I say, the buffalo to the Plains tribes are what the salmon are to us. And so, protecting our salmon, working on salmon restoration efforts is really important in terms of continuing our own physical survival and our own physical health, even in having that food source available for us. And so the work through Save California Salmon really resulted in not just understanding as salmon people how important that salmon is to us, but also in understanding, the strategies that have been put in place to continue to kill us out. That, we're here in 2022 and there are still just as California was founded on state-sponsored genocide, it's still continuing today, that 98% of the salmon species was killed out by the California Natural Resources Agency just in this past year, that there's not enough water for our salmon to survive, there's not enough water, and if there's not enough water for our salmon to survive, there's not enough water for us to survive as tribal peoples. And we recognize also this isn't just an issue that affects us, it affects everyone, right? And the clean health of our rivers overall. And so that was part of, the efforts when I worked for our tribe, for Pitt River, as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. You just get inundated with all of these meetings, all of these responses. And at the time, I was working, it was essentially a one-person department, working as the cultural information officer, working as the TIPO. There's just, you can't respond to all of the notices. And so when I transitioned out of that position and work now for Save California Salmon, I'm in the Sacramento Valley area now, where we're able to respond, where we're able to provide comments, where we're able to kind of just organize, whether it's through youth gatherings and youth camps to, which we hold, to also the educational component, that we have a curriculum that's focused on educational resources for Save California Salmon, and then also the advocacy piece, that we're able to show up to these, multiple meetings that they hold. There's the California Natural, the California Water, there's the Tribal Water Plan, there's the Natural Resources Agency, and then there's all of these kind of aligned and duplicate efforts. So whether it's through California state tribal organizations or through the water plans, we're able to respond in that way.
And do who you're working for now, is there a website anybody that the people that are watching can go check out?
Yes, it's californiasalmon.org.
Okay, cool, awesome. And is there any petitions or anything on there that anybody can sign?
There is a petition on there that mentions what I just spoke of, and I'll definitely send that over so that can be shared. I believe over the winter time we were able to get over 50,000 signatures on it. And so, yeah, just ensuring that people can sign up for updates. There's newsletters that go out, and then actions that are being held. There's, commenting that's needed at this time for the sites reservoir. Um, and so, and so, yeah, it's again designed in a way to keep people from responding. It's designed in a way to be very confusing. People don't understand why there's these multiple efforts and multiple water boards within the state that all are essentially are doing the same thing. And it's really to wear on the people that are advocating for the clean health of our rivers, clean health of our salmon, and for our salmon populations to be revitalized through the state. And it's also really interesting because they try to create this narrative of fish versus farmers, and how I was speaking to earlier about the farm worker communities, and that's part of my bloodline also. That's part of with my dad and uncles and my grandparents that all worked as farm workers. And so we understand that we are fighting a larger entity, that we are fighting the agrological industry. And so that it's not brown people being pitted against one another that are dealing with the same issues of toxic and polluted water, of not having clean foods to eat. That we recognize that we've witnessed it, that there are some of these almond producers and some of these larger companies that will bus their workers. They'll bus their workers to the state capitol to hold signs that say fish prefer less water flows, fish prefer to have less water, like basically holding signs that say fish prefer not to breathe.
Yeah.
So that there can be more water for the almonds. So
That's ridiculous. And like you said, saving the salmon saves much more than just the salmon. It saves the water. There's a bunch of, when they travel up and down from the ocean, there's species that that feed off of them. When they die off, the bears, it saves much more than the salmon. We have to think about everything else, the water, like I said, the earth. So thank you for that work, and thank you for spreading that information and giving information. So if anybody here wants to go and sign that petition, and definitely tune into that, because we definitely need to save the salmon, because 90 years without salmon in one river is a very long time. It's my mom's 71. That's 20 years, longer than her life. That's wild to think about. And like you said, the salmon is like the buffalo to the plains people. It's just wild that it's just another genocide that continues to happen. So yeah, I just want to move into my next question, and that's you've talked about your father being locked up in San Quentin and the work that he did after he was released. So now I want to talk about the work that you've done in restoring justice for indigenous peoples. And yeah, and I also wanted to ask, what are most indigenous communities affected by when they are going to these prisons?
Sure. So I'll say, I'm only speaking from my own experience, that I didn't have the 7 years of being incarcerated in the way that my father did. He worked with a lot of people and held a lot of, talking circles and sweats, and, really was dedicated, understanding that, there's a lot of factors that go into the incarceration of Native peoples. And so really addressing the historical effects of it. And so here in California, we have forts and missions, right? That those were the first forms of incarceration for California Native peoples, those were the first forms of enslavement for Native peoples, of being, held against their will and forced to eat out of pig troughs, just as the fort here nearby. I wanted to also share, in terms of the name of your podcast, Burn the Wagon, that there's a board game. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a board game that's being created called Burn the Fort. And so I was mentioning that would be really fun to be able to go to the nearby forts in the area and be able to, hold maybe like a half day of playing the game when it's released. It's being through Indigenous Action Media that's being created right now. So being able to set up some events where we could go play the board game. Yeah.
I'm absolutely down. I'm so down. I'm gonna look it up after we get off, and I'm gonna check it out. I'm gonna order it hopefully when it comes out.
Yeah, I'll send you the link for it. So it's
Awesome.
still in the prototype design at this time. But yeah, so just, addressing the historical effects. And so my own personal experience is that I was in Oakland still. I was attending Mills College at the time. And on my weekends, I would go and volunteer at the nearby Federal Correctional Institution, and that's called FCI Dublin. And so I would go to FCI Dublin, and it was just like a really interesting time because I was on a private college campus, that essentially really no one I could relate to, no one really looked like me. I would walk into these prison walls, which was, very manicured. If it wasn't for the iron bars and gates and electrical wire, like I would be on a school campus, is very much what it's designed to look like, right? And so, and I would just share in that time with the sisters and relatives inside, and both in the camp and in the maximum security. And so we would, share in stories and songs, and we would pray. And, it was just an opportunity to be able to volunteer and really enjoy their company and learning their stories. And it was also really frustrating because I would walk out of those walls knowing that out of those gates knowing that I would be able to go home and hug my children, and that there's so many relatives. There were parents, aunties, grandmas that may never have that opportunity again. And so recognizing that there was really a need for advocacy on that end of, honoring their stories, and also supporting them through both advocacy and policy changes. Another experience that I, learned while I was there is that many of them are not from the local area because it's federal. They're receiving charges, that would be 3 to 4 times what someone else would be charged, because they were charged on reservation lands, because they were being charged federally, that, they would ensure that they were being transferred from Alaska, that they were being transferred from the Southwest. So, they would put them from, what would be considered far locations, so that it would be more difficult for their families to be able to visit them, so that it would be,
Wow.
And that support wouldn't be there. And so it not only impacts them directly, but it impacts, the entire family and the community. And so when we link that to our missing and murdered Indigenous women, to our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, like we also include that in terms of our missing community members, because they're not there in the community. We all had different roles, right? We all had different ways that we contributed within our community. And so looking at it from that perspective, that these are our relatives that are also being stolen in that way, because they're not there and able to contribute to their families in the way that we would have within, our communities.
That's crazy to think about, that they would transfer somebody from Alaska all the way down here.
Oh, it happens all the time, for sure.
I didn't realize that was the case. I would just think it was, natives from, California. Wow, I didn't. Is there a website or an Instagram or anything like that people can tune in to the work that you're doing, or any
Sure.
way to help some of these people get some funds or get or anything, just letters written to them or anything like that?
Sure. So our website is indigenousjustice.org. And so we don't have an active IG at this time, but we do have a Facebook page just through Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples in terms of just like the community classes and events that we're holding right now. This evening, we'll be holding a beading class. It's just a basic beading class using two needles, a 2-needle process where we are just with the pandemic and not being able to hold events in person at this time, that was just kind of one of our offerings is that, where people sign up at the link and then we mail them out a beading kit. And then there's a number of different projects that people can work on and it's open to everyone.
Awesome, cool. So if anybody wants to tune into, will you share the link on the link on for the beading class on your Instagram?
I can share it, yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, if you guys want to check that out, definitely check that out. I kind of want to move into being the tribal community liaison and the International Treaty Council as well, and kind of see what that, because that all sounds new to me. I'm kind of new to that, so I just want to know. I personally want to learn from what that is as well.
Sure. So when I had shared earlier about being born in the AIM House, the Oakland Aim for Freedom Survival School, that was started by Bill Wapapa. And Bill Wapapa was very instrumental, especially throughout the Bay Area in terms of a lot of the organizing that was taking place in the late 1970s. And so he had organized the longest walk, the 1978 longest walk that went from Alcatraz Island to Washington, D.C. And at that time, there were treaties, not only, addressing the 18 treaties in California that were never ratified, but also addressing all of these different treaty issues and bills that address termination of Indian tribes, termination of our hunting and fishing rights. All of this was at stake at that time. And so there were our relatives that walked across the country in order to bring attention to that and in order to have all of that addressed. And so with that, Bill had also started the sunrise gatherings on Alcatraz Island in honor of the Alcatraz occupation and the the veterans that are now, it's been 52 plus years since the occupation of 1969 to 1971. It was a 19-month-long occupation, but it was probably about 10 years later when Bill started the sunrise gatherings. And so through the sunrise gatherings, they've been hosted by the International Indian Treaty Council. IITC is known as the international arm of the American Indian movement. It was after Wounded Knee happened in 1972, after Wounded Knee, and the leaders wanted, they wanted to have some sort of recourse. There was, they wanted to go to the international level and talk about the human rights violations that were happening against Native peoples, but there was not a seat at the table. Of course, the US government wasn't going to provide them, any sort of support in that way. So IITC still holds the UN general consultative status in terms of being able to bring issues internationally. Throughout California, we have gold, greed, and genocide campaigns that address the environmental racism and environmental justice issues throughout California. We know that, the gold rush is still known as the toxic legacy. We still see those effects today. I know that you had Jim Brown on previously that spoke to, the issues at Elam Indian Colony and how it was really the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Environmental Protection Agency, these entities that we that we believe are there and set up to protect us. But really, it was the EPA and the BIA that used the mine tailings from the nearby Superfund site and lined the roads with the mine tailings and also used those for housing foundation. And so we still very much see and experience those effects today in terms of the high cancer rates, the very high autism rates throughout the tribal communities, such as that are next door to a Superfund site that still have not fulfilled its promises of cleanup.
Wow. So you hold the seat on this council that speaks
I don't know. Let me just clarify. So I don't.
Okay.
I work as the California Tribal and Community Liaison.
Okay.
Our role is to work with the various tribal communities throughout California and support in that way. It's actually through my tribe, through Pit River Tribe, that they hold the seat as the board members and representatives. So that's Radley Davis. So he's an Ilmaui tribal member, and previous to Radley, it was Mickey Gimmel that was holding that seat. Mickey Gimmel was also involved in the Alcatraz occupation.
Wow, that's crazy. To even think about that, you're that close to, connected to amazing things, to bringing these voices, and that's kind of what I wanted to do with this podcast, is because a lot of times in history, and Jim Brown did this amazing. He talked about history, in the history books, we're kind of talked about in the past tense.
Sure.
And I that's what the whole thing with this podcast is, actually telling the history, how it is and how it's going to be, and how we want to do in the future. You know what I mean? We want to change these things. We want to stop this generational trauma, and we want to continue these things that you're doing. The work that you're doing, the work to bring back these traditional things, and hopefully bring them to the reservations, like we were speaking before, because they're not. I was lucky enough to learn from Clarence Carrillo when I was growing up, and I'm adopted. So, like you were saying, like not really. I've always felt not, because I'm not Pomo, but I was adopted from the first day of my life, and that's the only thing that I know.
Sure.
Being a Pomo person, and he was kind enough to bring me in as a kid and allow me to dance, and take me to schools, take me to museums, take me to all kind of different places, and learn, and I'm still learning the language, so, you know what I mean? So, and that's not going to change from me speaking about these issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were fortunate to dance with Clarence, and traveled with him, and when Lanny was still alive, throughout our childhood. And so just having all of those connections, being able to go, especially this time of year, getting into Strawberry Festival, like that was always a big deal growing up. And being at Kuliloklo, and they used to have an open Strawberry Festival that we would go and dance at, and I know that's still continued up there in PA. And so just thinking about the significance of that, and how that's continued on, and how that it has been made available for our youth in a way that it may not have been previously. So
Absolutely. And this is kind of the part of the podcast I kind of allow you to bring up any topics that I didn't bring up. I know you mentioned MMIW a couple of times. If you want to talk about that for a little bit, we just only have an hour, and I just don't want to get cut off.
for sure.
But yeah. Just speak about any topics or any. Also, I want to ask you: did you speak at an event here in Santa Cruz of the bell removal? I knew that was you. And I was trying to find you at that event, but because you said you had come from Ukiah that day.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, I know exactly where that is, And anytime I hear anybody from that area, I kind of want to connect with them. But I lost you. But here we are today. So yeah, any topics that I didn't bring up?
Yeah, that bell removal event was really, really beautiful, and they're still fighting it. I know down in the Gilroy area, where they're trying to have more bells instilled. And so I think it just really goes to show, with all of the efforts. We were here in Sacramento. It was during the George Floyd uprisings, and part of the volunteer work that I do is with Anti-Police Terror Project Sacramento. And so I co-lead the Healing Justice Committee, where we're in service to families that have been impacted by police terrorism and police violence. And it was really a go moment in terms of connecting issues throughout our communities at that time. And so there were, the efforts on the statue removal efforts. And so we created some event pages where we said, we're going to de-Sutter, de-Sarah, and de-Columbus the Sacramento Valley area. And this had been, pushed forward by, this wasn't, I just want to clarify, this wasn't just us. This was, community members over the past 25 years that had been calling for, the removal and really not wanting these statues to be represented within our communities. And so when we put that call out, within 2 weeks, all 3 of those statues were removed, the Sarah, the Sutter, and the Columbus statue from Sacramento. And so from that, in June and July of 2019, or 2020, I'm sorry, to, last summer with the bell removal event, it really is a collective effort of healing of our communities. It really is that effort of, shifting that narrative and telling the truth of our history as California Native peoples, that so much of it has been, silenced in that way. And so, yeah, even having this conversation and being able to share, there are a couple of events that I do want to share about that are upcoming. So there is an MMIW prayer run that's happening in Kumeyaay territories. I can send, and I'll post the link for that also, but that will be happening this weekend. On Sunday, there will be a march and prayer run, and they're going to 7 different peaks for 7 different of our family members, and that we are supporting. And so we're driving some of our MMIW family members down to go participate in that. And then that's happening. And then in May, we kind of shut down in-person events that we were organizing between January and May, just with the pandemic. But in May, we'll be holding May 5th in front of City Hall in San Francisco. Last year, we brought families together and community together, and there were some really beautiful songs and dances shared, and highlighting the issues of all of our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And City Hall was lit up in red. We'll actually be in Monterey County on May 6th, so I will share the info for that. Also, that Esalen tribe of Monterey, we're currently working with them. There will be 3 Zoom events starting February 28th at 5 p.m. And then we'll hold that in-person event. But there's lots of prayer runs and marches, rallies happening all the time. So I can update those links and send those links over to you to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I would really appreciate that. And thank you so much for coming on today. That's all the questions I had for you. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, and a bunch of people in here are thanking you too. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for bringing the connection. So yeah, everything that you're doing is amazing, and it's what I want to continue with this podcast, is decolonizing, that way of thinking, that way of learning, that way of living, it's just getting back to traditional way of living, So thank you for that work, and thank you for everything that you post too, and thank you for all the work that you've done with Khadijah Britton too. I grew up I remember watching her play basketball as in high school, because we played Covelo. She was amazing. So yeah, I try to say her name as many times as I can into a microphone anytime I can. So yeah, thank you for that too.
For sure, yes. With Khadijah, we just held an online vigil for the 4 years since she was disappeared, and we'll also be sharing her story and Nick Patterson's story. There will be some upcoming, I believe it will be on Yahoo News in April, sharing some information and just updates and getting their stories up in the, in some mainstream media about their disappearances. And so for all of the stories, we work with probably around 12 to 15 families that our MMIW and MMIR survivor families. And so just supporting them in that way, and for all of our relatives that are navigating our personal healing journeys.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course, take care, and thank you so much for having me on.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me today on Burn the Wagon, where we're here to burn down capitalism, burn down patriarchy, and burn down that motherfucking colonialism. See you guys.